Welcome, everybody, to the Amplify Long-Term Care podcast. This is your host, Frances Nahas. I am thrilled to be here today with Alan Rosenbloom, who's the president and CEO of Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition. Alan, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks. It's a pleasure to join you. I appreciate the opportunity. As you said, I'm Alan Rosenbloom. I'm the president of the Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition, which is an advocacy group based in Washington, D.C. We represent about 80% of the independent long-term care pharmacy community, which are pharmacies that serve about 1 million people a day in long-term care facilities like nursing facilities, assisted living centers, and to some degree in the community, people living at home as well. And we focus on representing the public policy and advocacy interests of the long-term care pharmacy sector in Washington.
Awesome. How did you end up in this position?
Random. No, actually.
That's what I say. I'm always like, I tripped and fell, and here I was. But yeah.
Now, my entire career has been in the healthcare space. After graduating law school and studying public policy at the Wharton School, I started practicing law, and I fell into the healthcare law business when it was still nascent. Nobody really had health law departments at that point, and developed an expertise in Medicare and Medicaid payment policy generally, but particularly for, at the time, long-term care facilities, nursing homes. That led me into joining a series and then ultimately becoming the CEO of a series of trade groups that represented long-term care facilities. The last of which was a large group called the Alliance for Quality Nursing Home Care that represented nursing home companies, basically, the bigger ones. And that ultimately merged into the American Healthcare Association about 10 years ago. So I was doing some consulting, and a group of long-term care pharmacies approached me about forming their own Washington-based advocacy group. So I worked with them as a consultant. One thing led to another, and here I am 9 years later, still running on SCPC.
So what I always find this curious, because I similarly sort of just found myself in healthcare and stuck around for a long time. What made you stay with healthcare?
Well, a couple things. First of all, there's the intellectual challenge of translating originally the law to the business world to the caregiving world. And then that expanded beyond just simply the law to policy, government. How does government think? The difference between political advocacy, substantive advocacy around policy changes for particular reasons. And I always am mindful that ultimately the organizations that I represent are providing care to people, to real people who need it. And while I'm obviously several steps removed from that process, I do believe that what I try to achieve is not only relevant to helping the healthcare providers as businesses, but also to helping them have the resources that they need to take care of people as well as they can.
Yeah, healthcare is just such an interesting intersection of business, high regulation and policy, and the world of public health, right? And actual kind of clinical caregiving for folks. It's fascinating and complex.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I always appreciated, and I try to do with some frequency, is to actually, when I was representing facilities, to actually be in the facilities. Because in that environment, you actually will, you see the patients and you see the residents, and you can understand and connect the dots back to the personal. That's not quite the same in long-term care pharmacy, although I still like to visit several pharmacies a year. Because the other thing you sometimes forget doing what I do and dealing generally with the people who are running these businesses is you come to recognize that there's also really what drives the effectiveness of these organizations is the people that they employ. And, very often you don't really make that connection. So it's important, I think, to keep the kind of human side of the healthcare business in mind, even as you're focused on, or I'm focused anyway, on things that aren't directly patient care oriented or even, staff oriented.
Yeah. So when you're out there and you're visiting long-term care pharmacies, or you're talking with the folks who are members of your organization, what's top of mind for them? What are the things that jump out for you that just is really critical?
Generally, the thing that mostly I hear, a couple things. Number one is the administrative burden of complying with this legal requirement and that regulatory provision, and et cetera. And then second, depending on the time of year and depending on what's going on in the market, there always seem to be some drugs that are more difficult to get than others, or drug shortages periodically, and just having to wrestle with substitutes become, that's also the second major theme.
Interesting. Yeah, that was something that was absolutely a lesson to me when I first started working in healthcare, and in part because it's not sort of the fancy specialty drugs that end up with a shortage. Sometimes it's aspirin, it's saline, it's things that are very basic that when you can't find it, it's
commonly used generics, right? That aren't that expensive. You're right. Specialty drugs, those are like, they're the high cost drugs.
Right.
So people want to have those available because they want to be able to earn, the revenues and the margins from higher cost drugs. And interestingly, one of the challenges with so-called specialty drugs is that many of them aren't specialty drugs; they're just high cost drugs.
Right. That there is no official definition of specialty, right?
Right. Yeah, and because of the way that companies have become vertically integrated and consolidated, around the ability of a pharmacy benefit manager to manage a formulary,
right?
And control networks, that very often most long-term care pharmacies can't get access to so-called specialty or high-cost drugs because their distribution is restricted by agreement between the manufacturers, basically in the PBMs.
Right.
Although the PBMs and the insurance companies blame the manufacturer, it's really kind of a joint deal, right? You get your drug on the formulary if you agree it's only going to be distributed to these pharmacies. That's a big problem, and I don't think it benefits the patients at all.
No.
And just for a quick personal anecdote, I had a knee problem, and I needed injections of hyaluronic acid, right? Which is basically, laboratory created chicken fat, essentially, right? Not, the only quote unquote specialty aspect to it is that it has to be refrigerated.
Okay.
Which is not something, which is something every pharmacy could do, right? But I go to the orthopedist and he says, I want to give you these injections. And I say, okay, fine. When can we do it? And he says 3 weeks. I said, why 3 weeks? Now, these are my interpretations of what he was saying, because he has all the details, right? But basically my PBM for our employer-sponsored health plan, which required that he get CVS specialty pharmacy.
Yep.
Right. And if he didn't, he put at risk his contract his contract with my health plan and with the other health plans. And so, I said to him, okay, how much does it cost out of pocket? And he told me, and it wasn't cheap, but I'm fortunate I was in a position where I could afford it. So I said, okay, tell you what, I will pay you out of pocket. I'll deal with the insurance company in the back end. What can you get? And he said 3 weeks. And that's because his contract to get paid by these insurers were at risk. So I had to wait 3 weeks for a drug that simply had to be refrigerated. And frankly, there was a pharmacy in the building. It was a medical office building. If they had it accessible, I could have gotten the injection that day. So I waited 3 weeks for the treatment that I needed because the PBM restricted access to a high-cost drug.
Right.
That did not require special handling, was not really specialty in any way, except it was high cost. And this is a problem that, long-term care pharmacies face in getting access to, expensive drugs that might be useful to patients. And if they could have it and gain access to it, they could get to patients a lot faster.
Yeah. So how do we change that? If you think of sort of policy in the space that you play, what are some of the things we can do that change the incentives there?
Well, it's interesting. Right now, there's legislation pending in Washington that would really, what it basically does is this is for Medicare Part D, but generally commercial markets in many ways follow what Part D does. So anyway, what this bill would do is say that a Part D plan through its PBM administrator cannot restrict access to high-cost drugs, so-called limited access drugs, unless two conditions are met. One, that the drug is identified by the Food and Drug Administration as restricted distribution, so that it can only be administered by doctors either in their offices or in a hospital. So those might be Medicare Part B drugs, but they're, so that's one. So basically the government.
So to make it real
for a legit reason.
Right. So these would be things like oncology drugs where you actually want a physician there monitoring the application of it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then the other condition is if the drug really does require certain special handling or instructions or kind of hands-on administration, that not every pharmacy in a network could administer.
Okay.
Right. And so it would really narrow the scope of drugs that plans could say you can only use this pharmacy for.
It would actually give a definition.
As long as the pharmacy's in the network for the insurance company, then every network pharmacy should have access to those drugs. And if that becomes law, if that legislation, and actually there's legislation that's the same both in the Senate and in the House.
Yeah.
If that gets to be actual law, that would be a really significant step for independent long-term care pharmacies and independent pharmacies more generally.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I always go back to how a bill becomes a law, sort of. This is a song that we learned when we were kids, right? How's that happen? Where are things in Washington? What's the likelihood that this could pass? Yeah. What do things look like?
Yeah. Well, let's talk specifically for starters about legislation that's designed to constrain the abuses of PBMs.
Yep.
That legislation actually has reasonable prospects of moving forward. And as you say, how does a bill become a law? Well, obviously the two chambers of Congress, but then there are committees within each chamber that have jurisdiction over various aspects of healthcare delivery. Yep. Depending on who's doing the paying. If it's Medicare, it's one committee in the House. If it's Medicaid, it's another committee in the House, although sometimes they share jurisdiction. If it's the commercial markets, it's yet another committee. If it's the VA, it's yet another. And if it's healthcare for active duty military services members, it's yet another. Yeah. Right. And that's part of the problem is it's hard to get consistency across everything. Having said that, the major PBM reform legislation is under consideration in the Senate. From the point of view of long-term care pharmacies, the most important programs are Medicare and Medicaid. There are there's other, but those are the big ones. That's the Senate Finance Committee. In July, the Senate Finance Committee, got a bill through the committee, which means it's ready to go to the floor with a variety of PBM reforms. Today, as a matter of fact, the day we happen to be taping this, there's a hearing on another bill that includes additional protections for pharmacies. And that all looks good for getting to the Senate floor and probably getting enough votes in the Senate to, get it into the process of a, resolution of a bill between the two chambers and getting to the president's desk. In the House, there was a major piece of legislation that was largely around transparency and disclosure that came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee earlier this year.
Because it makes sense that Energy and Commerce governs healthcare. Super logical.
Energy and Commerce, it's commerce, right? So it's Medicaid,
commerce.
And some aspects of Medicare. And the other, then there's the Ways and Means Committee, which of course also says screens healthcare, right? But that has some jurisdiction as well. And in addition, there's going to be some more legislation next week that Energy and Commerce will consider. So if you look at the broad politics around PBM reform, I would say the preponderance of the weight right now is in favor of it. Of course, the insurance companies and the PBMs are arguing against it, and they have supporters as well. But if it were simply an up or down vote by both chambers of Congress as to whether to pass PBM reform legislation, it would be passed. That, however, is not how the process works. Right? Because you'll get both chambers that will move this legislation, but then it will be included in some bigger package because Congress has difficulty doing things except in these big packages because of the political conflict that makes it hard to get things done, which leads us to the recent fight over the Speaker of the House and Mike Johnson from Louisiana emerging as the current Speaker of the House, because in order to pass legislation, you actually have to have agreement by everybody. And the House Republicans right now, especially the kind of, the MAGA wing of the House Republicans, really don't want to compromise on things like whether to continue funding the government, whether to pass major pieces of legislation, et cetera. So there is some risk that by the end of this year, there won't be a year-end package. And if there isn't a year-end package, the PBM reform legislation will not be done this year. However, it could be done next year, too soon to tell.
Right.
So if these bigger political forces get resolved, then we will see PBM reform legislation this year, I think.
Okay.
I don't, if not, we'll see what happens.
Which is farther than it's been in a lot of years, right? So and I think of it as sort of, hey, something's got to get written. It's got to go to a committee. It's got to get out of the committee to even get to the floor. You've got to have something that process has to happen in both houses, right? The House and the Senate.
Yeah.
You've got to reconcile things to get them to match ultimately to get it onto the president's desk, and you've got to get it passed. So we've actually, it sounds like, made decent progress if there's things happening in both the House and the Senate, and it's made it through committees in both the House and the Senate. And now it's a question of, hey, can we get something passed on the floor and actually reconciled between am I, like, not being in the policy world, did I kind of summarize that well?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it is similar to, although much slower and more complex than negotiations in business.
Yeah.
Right. You want to make a business deal with somebody else. You have a back and forth discussion. Maybe there are multiple parties, and ultimately you work something out. That is generally the way Congress should work, right? And there should be compromise. You should come up with something that is sufficiently acceptable that everybody feels like they got 75%.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And unfortunately, over the last pretty much 10 to 15 years, that process has not worked very well in Congress. And so we've ended up at the end of the year, we've ended up with these series of, artificial crises because we can't get appropriations bills done. So we don't have funding for the government. And that gets used as a political tool to try to negotiate changes that you wouldn't otherwise be able to negotiate, right? Like the thing that kind of that ended Kevin McCarthy's speakership was that members of his caucus wouldn't agree to a compromise to keep the government funded. So Speaker McCarthy had to go get some Democrats to support that compromise to prevent the government from shutting down.
Right.
And the folks who were more, the kind of MAGA wing of the Republicans in the House said, well, that's a bridge too far. You can't compromise with Democrats because they're the evil empire.
Right.
And that is not, in my view, a little editorial comment, I don't think that's the best way to run a government, right? Nobody gets 100% of what they want ever in life. And there's no reason the government should be any different, So having said all of that, the good news is that when SCPC started 9 years ago, most members of Congress had no idea what a PBM was.
Right.
Right. And now 9 years later, I think through our efforts, not uniquely through our efforts, it was a major effort across the sector. Not only does Congress know what PBMs are, but a majority appreciate the abusiveness of their practices and are trying to do something about it. And that's a big change. But as I said, you want to cut a business deal, it takes a couple of months, right?
Right.
You want to change public policy, it takes a couple of decades.
Right. I always say, give it 10 years. We'll see.
Exactly.
So let's say this all goes through next year, that some bill passes. What does it mean for long-term care pharmacies?
Well, in part, it depends on what's in there, right?
Yeah.
But it means a couple of things. Number one, in an ideal world, the holy grail from our point of view of PBM reform would be, number one, equalizing payments. What do I mean by that? I mean that a PBM that has an affiliated pharmacy can't pay its affiliated pharmacies more than it's paying unaffiliated pharmacies. That would be a big win.
So to make it real, that's CVS as a PBM can't pay CVS Pharmacy or CVS Specialty Pharmacy or CVS Mail Order Pharmacy more than it pays another pharmacy that's in one of their networks. Same for United, same for Optum, right? And Optum's pharmacy, same for,
And, everybody that has a pharmacy. So,
which is
Express
most of them
has the largest mail order pharmacy. CVS Caremark has the largest retail, second largest mail order, the largest specialty, and the largest long-term care pharmacy. Optum has a mail order business. Same sort of thing. Yeah, you get it. You get the idea here.
Yep. Okay. So that's one. So there's got to be equality of the payments.
Number two is that, okay, let me back up,
Yeah.
right? There's a provision called the any willing pharmacy provision in Medicare Part D. And what it
Okay.
basically means is that if you're a pharmacy, in long-term care, retail, doesn't matter, and you want to participate in a Part D network, if you will accept the basic or quote standard, close quote, terms and conditions that the plan is offering, then you can participate in the network. But those standard terms and conditions usually are horrible.
Right.
And so they're a disincentive rather than an incentive. There is legislation under consideration right now that would require the CMS to establish a baseline of reasonable and relevant terms that have to be included in standard terms and conditions.
Okay.
And what this would, and this is a kind of rising tide floats all boats thing, right?
Yeah.
Because if the floor right now is really low, then when plans and PBMs negotiate on top of that horrible floor, they can push people down.
Yep.
Right? Because they say, well, you could accept this. This is better than the floor
Right.
that you would otherwise accept. So this would elevate that floor.
Okay.
And by elevating the floor, it would improve the ability of pharmacies to negotiate their contracts directly with plans. This is all Medicare Part D. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that the way the legislation was drafted, it doesn't include long-term care pharmacies.
Oh, interesting.
However, the good news is that we SCPC have been able to get the Senate Finance Committee to change that provision so that when the bill is finally, put in its filed form, we'll be protected. Okay. So it'll be relevant to retail and long-term care pharmacies. Right. That's number two.
Yeah, because if you think of long-term care pharmacies, what % roughly of their reimbursement actually comes from Medicare Part D? I would imagine very high.
Yeah, 75%.
Yeah.
On average.
So if you exclude them, right, that's massive, right? Because it's the majority of their business.
Yeah. And frankly, this is a fight we constantly have because there is no definition of long-term care pharmacy in federal statute, right? One of the things we've been pushing for is to get such a definition. And we came very close last year. Unfortunately, you don't always get what you want. We're hoping that by the end of this year, we'll be able to get that done. But this is a recurring problem, not only in Part D, where actually there's more of an understanding of long-term care pharmacy than any place else in the federal government. And yet, we confront the kind of obstacles I just described.
Right. Because by process,
so that's kind of an ongoing thing.
Yeah. Because by process, we know what a long-term care pharmacy is, right? If you're running one, you've got to get an NPI that allows for kind of closed door operation, right? There is a process definition. There's just not a legal definition.
Well, there's no statutory definition.
Okay.
CMS has a one sentence legal regulatory definition, which basically says a long-term care pharmacy is a pharmacy that serves people in long-term care facilities.
Okay.
It'll be certain. And then the Part D requirements have these conditions that a Part D plan has to demonstrate that the pharmacies that it considers to be long-term care pharmacies in its network meet. And those are the things you would think of, 24/7, 365 access to a pharmacy, consultant pharmacist, the delivery, the specialized packaging, the provision of emergency meds. There are like 10 conditions, right? So that's a common understanding of long-term care pharmacy. The challenge is that if it isn't in a statute, then when Congress is doing something else, like this any willing pharmacy change that I just talked about, nobody is looking at its applicability to the long-term care pharmacy subset of the pharmacy market. And as a result, we SCPs are constantly in this struggle to get Congress to modify legislation that takes into account the distinction between retail and long-term care.
Got it.
And so that's why we feel this legislation is so important.
Got it. Okay. So that was two things. What was the other?
Well, the third thing that I actually am very excited about is that Part D plans often use what they call quality metrics or performance metrics, not only to evaluate pharmacy performance, but then to adjust payment. And unfortunately, over time, these have this has become less to do with actual quality for patients.
Right.
And it is less to do with things that are within the pharmacy's control and more to do with how can the plans manipulate the measures to reduce payments to pharmacies. So this legislation that's pending changes that. It would require CMS to establish standardized quality metrics that plans could select from to do these kinds of performance evaluations, but they'd have to use metrics that were that had been developed through a consensus stakeholder process. And as originally conceived and originally proposed, there was no differentiation among types of pharmacy. And we felt it was very important, given the unique characteristics of the long-term care patient population and the additional services that long-term care pharmacies provide, that there be long-term care pharmacy-specific metrics. And I'll give you an example of why. One of the metrics that commonly gets used is adherence. Are people, well, in the retail context, are people refilling their prescriptions? Because you can't guarantee.
Which
that
I always laugh because I was going to say, which is
right?
actually just do they have the pills, not true adherence, but
Right. But think about adherence in the context of a long-term care facility.
Right.
Adherence in a nursing home, for example, is like 99.9%. So that's not a reasonable way to differentiate the quality of a long-term care pharmacy.
Yeah.
Right. Similarly, there are medications that are less commonly used in the general population, more commonly used in long-term care, or vice versa, because there are certain drugs that pose greater risks to older adults, right, or people with healthcare, compromised healthcare system, and so that's why it's so important that there be unique long-term care pharmacy or long-term care patient population metrics. And we were able to build that into the legislation as well, because it originally drafted didn't have that differentiation.
Interesting. Yeah.
So those, I think, are the three biggest things that are in there at the moment. And then the final thing, of course, is what I mentioned earlier, which is the access to specialty drugs or high-cost limited access drugs.
Right.
I think if we got, those four things, it would radically restructure the relationships between PBMs and long-term care pharmacies to the better for pharmacies.
Right. So if you're a long-term care pharmacy, what should you be doing? What should you be paying attention to right now?
Well, you should be joining SCPC. Sorry for
no,
the
that's all right.
commercial.
Hey, you're allowed. Yeah, give your commercial. How do pharmacies do that?
Seriously, I think that's important. And the reason I think it's important is that there really is strength in numbers. The more resources we have, the more effective we can be. Yeah, that's just the reality of Washington. Having said that, I think it's important that pharmacies, and I realize they've got a day job, right? They've got to run the business.
Yeah.
But so much of their business is contingent on what the decisions that policymakers make, that I think understanding them and trying to be involved in ways that shape policies to benefit rather than hurt pharmacies, or at least to be neutral with respect to pharmacies, is important. And I could give you an example of something that is coming. It has already started to come at the sector, but is going to come at the sector, exponentially more significantly than it already has. And that's the impact of, federal policy-driven reductions in drug prices.
Okay, yeah, this is a big one because we're starting to see this.
You want to go? You want to go there?
Yeah, let's go there.
Okay. So there are two aspects. You're probably aware that insulin prices have dropped pretty significantly this year, like 70%.
Right.
Do you know why?
No.
Okay. The reason is that the American Recovery Act, the Biden COVID reform bill that, you can argue the country didn't necessarily need, they needed to pay for it. And so what they did is they changed the way that state Medicaid programs calculate rebates for manufacturers.
Okay.
It used to be, and basically the deal is that if the cost of a drug from the time it's introduced exceeds the rate of inflation over a period of time, then the rebate that manufacturers have to pay is higher than the standard rebate. And there used to be a floor on that. In other words, if the rate of inflation accelerated so much, you could, as a manufacturer, have to essentially give the drug away for free to Medicaid beneficiaries. But with insulin, even if they gave it away to Medicaid beneficiaries because they were selling it at such a higher price in the commercial markets and in other markets, it was worth it.
Right.
This bill eliminated the floor.
Okay.
So what that would have meant is that instead of paying nothing, giving it away for free, they would have had to pay state Medicaid programs over $100 per dispense
Just
for
to
insulin.
dispense their drug.
And,
Yeah.
and so that caused them to say, well, we got to get out of this. We're going to crash the price.
Right.
And that's what's driven the drop. But nobody thought about the secondary effects on pharmacies.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, the way the long-term care pharmacy payment system works, and retail is analogous, although the numbers don't quite add up in the same way. About 70% of the prescriptions that long-term care pharmacies dispense, they lose money on just because of what they get paid.
Yep.
And on 30%, that's where they make both revenues and margin, especially in the margin, of course, is the important part to stay in business. And insulin's one of those drugs.
Yeah.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we've now seen the 10 drugs that are going to be the first 10 drugs subject to price negotiations under the Inflation Reduction Act.
Right.
And that process has already started. And if you look at that list of 10 drugs, 8 of them are used heavily in long-term care.
Interesting.
And by the way, first 2 years of the program, 2026 and 2027, all of the drugs are Part D as in David drugs, not Part B as in boy drugs.
Right.
So that means that we're talking about the drugs that are heavily used in long-term care, that represent 75% of the revenues that long-term care pharmacies earn, that represent the lion's share of the margin that long-term care pharmacies earn. And you're about to drop the price, the bottom out of the prices. As compared to wholesale acquisition costs or WAC, we estimate, and I emphasize that this is an estimate based on certain assumptions that may or may not be true, but we estimate that as compared to the WAC price, the so-called market fair price, or MFP, which is the standard, is going to be anywhere from a third less to 2/3 less on those drugs, which is just going to ripple through the pharmacy world. So the biggest concern, I think, the biggest opportunity is the PBM reforms that I've talked about. The biggest concern, the biggest challenge, and one that could be existential for at least some long-term care pharmacies, is the risk that these dramatic reductions in prices are going to have such a profoundly negative effect on pharmacies that it'll be hard to remain in business.
Yeah.
Now, again, emphasizing that that's based on certain assumptions that may or may not prove true as the negotiations play out and as the plans and the PBMs respond. But it should be of significant concern. And I think, unfortunately, a large chunk of not only the long-term care pharmacy sector, but the pharmacy world entirely isn't as aware as it should be yet of what those adverse implications could be and how to deal with it.
Yeah. It's such a tricky problem. We were talking about, I was at a conference last week where we were talking about pricing in pharmacy, and it's the struggle of like, look, you can look at the overall spend on drugs in the US, and it's clearly going up faster than inflation, which is a challenge. But there's this concept of sort of what's the consumer perception of a single drug versus the way most folks in the industry operate. And that's true whether you're a pharmacy or a PBM or some other dispensing organization. You look at price across a formulary. And so trying to target an individual drug for pricing gets really complicated when the business operates on, a formulary where in some cases you lose money, and in some cases you might make more, disproportionately more, because it balances out when you look at it across the whole list of drugs. So it's a really tricky problem. And I also think it takes us back to the shortage question, right? So there's some drugs where if the pharma company is not making enough money on the drug, it makes them really hard to justify manufacturing it. And this is how we end up in a lot of shortage situations, and why it's the most common generics, right, that fall into that category versus the really expensive specialty drugs. I didn't realize kind of the overall impact when you look at it in a long-term care pharmacy.
Yeah. One of the, I think, flaws of the entire American healthcare delivery system is that we are constantly cross-subsidizing.
Yep.
And it's probably at its most complex in the drug distribution system, but it's not unique to the drug distribution system.
Yeah.
And frankly, when we talk, you mentioned generics, you're familiar with MedPAC, the Medicare, it's basically,
but define it for folks who might not know.
Yeah. MedPAC is a congressionally created agency that advises Congress on what's going on with Medicare. So and so they have a very highly respected voluntary commissioners who serve. They have a professional staff here in Washington, and they they will do periodic analyses and reports to Congress, and they have, I think, monthly meetings that are public and so on. And they just announced that they are doing a study of what Medicare Part D pays for generics. Their thesis is that they are paying too much for generics.
Yeah.
In other words, for because of various manipulations and so on.
Yeah.
From the pharmacy perspective, the good news is that they want to see whether or not, there's the variability of what pharmacies get paid for generics is manipulation by the insurance companies in the Part D plans and the PBMs. The bad news is that they're starting from the premise that because of that manipulation, Part D is paying too much for generics.
Yeah.
So, there's an assault on all sides on drug prices, which from the consumer point of view is entirely appropriate and a great thing. But there is a lack of awareness of the secondary effects that all of those changes are going to have on the ability of pharmacies to provide the medications and the services that they provide. Yeah. And so I think it's incumbent on the whole sector, but especially the long-term care pharmacy component of the pharmacy world, to appreciate this problem and to come together in a unified way to engage politically and in developing policy solutions that will protect pharmacies. Because at the end of the day, pharmacies didn't cause high drug prices, and so they shouldn't be the ones that have to pay for fixing it.
Right. It is this question of sort of, okay, prices have gone up, and where is it going, right? Who's benefiting, and how do you balance the scales there? And I'll shamelessly steal an example from this past week that I heard from the CEO of UNC Health, where he was talking about, now he's talking about running a hospital, but it's the same analogy if we think of a long-term care pharmacy, which is, hey, imagine it's a car dealership, but for the first 60 cars you sell, you don't make any money. And then you have a tranche of cars where maybe you break even. And so you're trying to make up your entire profitability with that last tranche of cars. And so now imagine in the scenario, right, what you're talking about, which is, hey, they've taken 5 types of cars, but they're all in the ones where you already lose money, and they're trying to lower prices more. And what's you squeeze one end of the balloon and what happens? This is the struggle. And it's, how do you articulate that in a world where the consumer experience is often, drug prices are really going up and it's getting a lot harder.
Exactly. And it's just very complicated, and it's very hard to explain. It's hard to explain to members of Congress,
Right. So let's do the shameless advertisement. You work for Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition. If we've got listeners who want to be engaged, how do they get engaged?
Well, first of all, we do have a website, just like most other people. If you just search for Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition, you'll find it, which will, I think, number one, give you a sense of what our priorities are. Number two, give you a sense of our approach. And our approach, we start with analysis. You need to know, you need to have data. You need to have analysis. You need to have the kind of information that can persuade policymakers, not just members of Congress, but their staffs, agencies like MedPAC, who are very data driven. You have to, something beats nothing every day. And if you can't provide credible evidence to support what you are claiming, you lose in Washington. So that's step number one. And you will see extensive analytic work that we've done over the last 5 or 6 years with various third-party research firms. Then, you gotta have kind of a grassroots base. That is, you have to have relationships back home with members of Congress. And so the broader we have participation in the long-term care pharmacy world in our organization, the better we're going to do with that. You mentioned before, UNC health system, I guess, right? There's a hospital in every community. There is not a long-term care pharmacy in every community, although there's a lot of need for long-term care. And so the more long-term care pharmacies that are coordinating behind a unified advocacy effort, the more effective that advocacy effort is going to be, right? And so, I would encourage everybody to join SCPC. We have a track record of achieving results and making changes in policy that benefit long-term care pharmacies specifically. That's our mission. There are lots of organizations who represent pharmacies incredibly well, but we are the only ones that uniquely focus on the public policy needs of long-term care pharmacies as businesses.
Yep.
And so that's from my point of view, our major selling point.
Yeah. And I think of it, the big companies, they all fund government affairs organizations, right? They view it as a very important part of their business because they operate in a world that does have to comply with regulation and where those regulations can change. And so what I think about a lot is, hey, if you're a smaller organization, you're not employing that yourself. How are you making sure your voice is getting heard on equal footing with those really large companies who are going to have folks in Washington talking to everybody?
Most long-term care pharmacies are not large enough to really have kind of in-house government relations, right? So that's our role is to try to fill that gap. And while David can and often does beat Goliath, David still needs the stones for the sling.
Yeah, there you go. That's a great one. That's a great one. So when you're not on the Hill engaging in sort of, the constant 10-year walk to get stuff done, what do you do for fun?
Oh, what do I do for fun? I think about public policy.
Me too sometimes. Is that wrong?
I guess, first of all, family, and a lot of my time with family translates into travel. Yeah. Which I kind of put into three buckets. My wife and I travel, but we generally do the kind of, go see Europe. We just drove around Scotland for a couple of weeks, summer, et cetera.
You're talking to a true travel buff, so this is like right in my wheelhouse here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then I travel with my son, who is an adult, but he used to play lacrosse. He coaches lacrosse. So one of the things we do every year is go to the NCAA Final Four.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that's kind of one of those things. He and I also try to arrange at least one other trip a year for something together. Yeah. Last January, we went to Mexico for a week and just kind of hung out at a resort. Yeah. We're actually tonight going to London for a week. Oh, wow. I love London. To watch football matches. Yeah. I love London too. One of my favorite places. So it'll be fun. And then I also on my own do adventure travel. Oh, fun. I've hiked 3 times in the Himalayas. Yeah. In Nepal, Bhutan. I've done some of this in the Alps, and I am going to Africa in February to go hike for mountain gorillas in Uganda or Rwanda. So I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah.
What's your favorite place you've ever been? If you can limit it to one, or give me a top 3. That's too hard.
Okay. Top 3. I loved Bhutan. Yeah. I really did. I just like the people. I like the culture. I like the vibe, the feel. Yeah. Like that a lot. Probably Italy would be on my list. I especially like Tuscany and Florence. Florence is one of my favorite places. And I guess I would say London. Yeah. Really do love London. I've been there a lot. I have relatives there. I have friends there, and I know the city reasonably well, and it's just always a good place for me to be. I feel very comfortable there.
Yeah, if I have to pick a city, London's probably my favorite. So right there with you on that one. Yeah. Fantastic. So I think the lesson is, hey, at some point you got to get your head out of the political stuff. Go someplace really far away and clear your mind before you come back to this. Right?
Yeah, actually, what I do almost every day is we live fairly close to a park, wooded area, and I have a golden retriever, so we usually go for a walk in the woods, and that's good on a daily basis to clear one's head.
A little bit of nature usually helps with the frustration of
I noticed the plant behind you, for example.
Which I'm not sure is real, but we'll set that aside.
Oh, I see. I gotcha. Yeah, well, I probably should have referenced that then.
But, our stage studio, right? It looks very pretty. It looks very pretty, right? Symbolic of nature.
Absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you participating in the podcast. It was a great conversation. I'm a nerd for the policy stuff. I think it's really important, even if I don't do it every day. And for folks who are interested in getting engaged, we'll include more information about the Senior Pharmacy. I'm going to say it wrong every time. Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Bye-bye. Thanks for being with us today, everybody. This is our pharmacy podcast for long-term care. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe and continue to listen for great conversations around long-term care and how to elevate your pharmacy.